Hello everyone, this is Kestrel. The first thing I wanted to do was continue talking about my trip to Hillsdale in early November 2019. I'm putting that on hold for a little bit to do this episode, where I wanted to talk about President Trump's victory in a very short period of time, really just a couple months, over two of the world's top terrorist masterminds, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and most recently Qasem Soleimani, who was the Iranian regime's terrorist mastermind. He is now in a bunch of bloody pieces, shipped home in a box to be burnt and tortured by hellhounds. Now, there's a lot more to the story. If you remember from the 2016 USA presidential elections, all throughout the campaigns and debates, the Democrats did everything they could to portray businessman and new Republican candidate at that time. Then, as the spring and summer went on, he became the Republican nominee, Donald John Trump. John is his middle name, Donald J. Trump. Middle name is John. Now, President Trump, they're portraying him as this mad, goofy clown who would punch the nuclear war launch button at the slightest provocation. Trump's actual presidency and approach to international policy has proven quite the opposite. Donald Trump had actually, years before, when asked about his view on whether the United States should go to war with Iraq, this was in the early 2000s, he was initially very hesitant about it. He ultimately said, I think his exact quote actually was, "I guess so, but if we're going to do that, we should do it right," meaning carefully and strategically. Trump was never in his life a warmonger. He liked to build businesses, hire people, make their lives better and more productive by giving them jobs and opportunities, but not handing them a check without diligent hard work on their part. All throughout my childhood and adolescence and beyond, kid shows were constantly portraying businessmen as villains only interested in money. Usually they called it profit, but never actually bothered to explain the difference between income and profit. The difference is actually very simple. Income is the money received by you or your business for its services and or products, whereas profit is that amount, the income, after subtracting the expenses of inventory, equipment, paying the employees, buying food if you provide it, raw materials, and of course every kind of tax you're required to pay, as well as benefits to employees. Because of these subtractions, net profit is, even for gigantic corporations, often not all that much. And then, of course, there is money you spend on investing and expanding, and both of those are very complicated. I watched countless tales and episodes of the greedy businessmen who wanted to build a burger joint or parking lot in place of the small town's last grove of ginkgo trees or a kid's playground or neighborhood park. But these were very cartoony plots with very little realism to them. First of all, those are usually not the places where those kinds of things are built. Parks and local forest patches remain untouched for generations because often there is a written into local policy agreement to leave them as such. I should note there's a lot of forest where I live for exactly this reason. There's even a nature center within walking distance that's in a large wild woods habitat, not quite a large enough patch to be called a forest, although where I live is very scattered forest with suburban residential areas. Anyway, where there was a long time ago, something like 70, 80 years ago, initially going to be a highway, but the community got together, purchased the land, and legislated for the land to be turned into a nature center. So that was going about it right. And there's plenty of highways and roads not too far away. So we actually reached a very good balance with wooded areas and residential and business areas. This is Northeast Ohio. But the worst offender of this kind of portrayal of the evil, greedy businessman that comes to my mind that I saw as a little kid, the early 1990s, was the show Captain Planet, which was written when the Soviet Union was still standing. Not that the show ever bothered to explain the hellscape that was that Soviet Union was, which makes watching it now very awkward. I mean, if you can even get it now, I'm sure you can if you really try. But what also makes watching it really awkward again, if you try, is the fact that the villains were extremely cartoony villains, usually only polluting the planet just because they wanted to be jackasses, despite the reality that that would both be a waste of their time and actually very bad for business. One wonders what shows like that might have actually taught us if they had put effort into going into real detail about weighing the pros and cons of land and resource management. And don't tell me that children wouldn't have been able to follow it. First of all, you don't need to go into excessive detail to explore and explain the basics of uncertainty and negotiation in matters like these. And second of all, children are naturally smarter than most adults think they are or think they remember being as children. I'm not saying that they are wiser in judgment than adults think, but they are smarter and more able to handle hard questions. Let's face it, even adults suck at coming up with realistic answers or good judgment. And the people who suck at productive answers most of all somehow always seem to end up in government jobs, which explains why resource management is often handled so irresponsibly. It takes years, even decades, of Marxist teachers boringly bumbling on and on about dry facts and figures unrelated to any real-life applications and spitting leftist propaganda until the youngsters are reduced to being only able to speak lefty language. It takes all that time and effort and just the killing of the natural adventure soul of children to deprive the once brave and adventurous children into socialist, communist, let's have free love and divert the consequences to other people and generations way down the line, zombies, and the factories that turn hordes of previously brazen and inquisitive kids and teens into such zombies wear the steel and concrete skins of once noble universities. This is exactly what happened to the millennials. And even though the power of the government has begun to crack with the rise of independent media and the exposure of the mainstream news and their socialist anti-free market, and particularly now, what's really exposed them anti-Trump at all costs, narrative and agenda, the war to save the West, and by extension, freedom throughout the world, is still far from won. While many people believe the battle will be won by the new Generation Z, I individually, because I am neither an optimistic person nor one who puts a whole lot of value on mere hope, believe that the war to reclaim our freedom and sanity will take multiple generations. Not that it can't be done, it's just going to take more than 1 or 2 generations to do it. Some millennials have broken from the leftist hold on them. I myself have I have a somewhat odd situation in that because of very poor health over the entire course of my formative years, leading to, well, it's a very long story, but multiple organ failures. Thanks a lot, bad luck of genetics. My genetics suck. Well, in some ways. In other ways, I'm actually quite resilient, but that was fought for, not inherent. Anyway, for a long time, I was effectively taken out of active participation in the affairs and events of the world for almost an entire decade, really, almost from 2008 or 9 to about 2016. In fact, the 2016 presidential election was when I was most recently really beginning to um, effectively recover and re-enter the workforce. I did this first by going into volunteering at the Natural History Museum, where I am. Then I'm going into well, I so last year I took this 16-week course for CNC machining. This is computer numerical machining, building small parts for medical, uh, military, laboratory, scientific laboratory technology, using these giant machines to carve teeny little parts. I'm supposed to be in line for getting a job at Swagelock. They're communicating with me very few and far between. Not saying the job doesn't exist, but I'm getting kind of anxious to hear a final report on where and what exact position they want to send me. But maybe I just have to wait it out. Actually, one of the things I'd like to do is continue with these American Kestrel shows. I am lacking resources to do so. If you want to help me out a little bit, give me that initial launch. Support me on Patreon. I'm gonna try to. I'm gonna try to these following couple of years. I'll try to improve my computer technology. Try to improve my networking. I just need a little bit of help getting launched, since everywhere I apply to is taking a really long time to answer me. So anyway, for the time being, it's only been about 2 weeks. Yeah, about 2 weeks into the year 2020, and President Trump has triumphantly quelled the threat posed by the Iranian regime. On December 27th, 2019, an Iranian militia swarmed, attacked, and attempted to burn down the American embassy in Iraq. President Trump quickly and decisively sent the U.S. Marines to defend the embassy, preventing a repetition of the devastation of Benghazi, and then took out Iran's top terrorist mastermind, Qasem Soleimani, in a precise and calculated strike. And the Iranian regime, the response from the Iranian people is actually quite interesting. We're finding out more about that today, but the Iranian regime, Soleimani's allies, cried like wusses and whimpered like dogs, including a lot of people in the American mainstream media who are so determined to prevent Trump from looking good or gaining a victory at all that they've reduced themselves to actually to effectively supporting the Iranian regime, to supporting terrorists over their own country that even they themselves is the president and their job to protect, but only President Trump is actually doing that. The mainstream media and the leftists and the head of the government are they're blaring Islamist Iranian regime propaganda, even at the expense of their people. What was particularly interesting today is that there are marches of protest from the Iranian people against their own regime, turning out in the streets in hordes to protest the oppression of their own government. There's this very interesting footage where in the streets there's there's an Israeli flag and an American flag in the streets. So before people were symbolically stomping all over them. But the people turning out to protest are deliberately trying to avoid them, to go around them. They can completely go around them. They are kind of stepping on the sides, but that's unavoidable. They're chanting that we are not the enemies of America. We are not the enemies of Israel. We are the enemies of the people in the government oppressing us. So Trump, rather than declare war against Iran, which he didn't want to do, the Iranian people did not want war with Israel or America. The American people did not want war with Iran. So President Trump sent in the Marines to defend the embassy in Iraq that was attacked by Iranian militia, defended his soldiers, took out one of the top terrorists in the world, and of course a couple months ago he had taken out Bakr al-Baghdadi, which was an amazing triumph. It was an amazing victory. Both of these were amazing victories. The media will not acknowledge, will go to extreme, treacherous lengths to not even acknowledge that Trump scored a victory. A victory for nonviolence, well, for anyone who doesn't want war. He made war not necessary with this move. I mean, if you don't want the war, if you don't want the world constantly enveloped in endless, stupid wars, what Trump did was precise, was intelligent, and it avoided war. It didn't spark it, it avoided it. He avoided it, or his call. And President Trump is correct when he says these military decisions, these decisions of war, you have a very small window in which to call them, and you got to make a decision. It's actually similar with quite a few large decisions in life. There are certain points at which you have to make key choices, and the fallout from those choices can be good or bad, but once you make them, you're stuck with them. This was a good choice. It was a good call. Now, as to the matter of preparing for the 2020 election, which will take place in the early weeks of November 2020, when it begins to approach, keep a close eye on the day the voting booths open. Democrats might just try and spread false information, so keep your eyes and ears peeled. In the state the world is in today and the amazingly successful military decisiveness of President Trump, is there really anyone else who can endure as much as he has and yet still remain strong, stand firm, and committed to protecting America's interests and deploying our military only as much as needed? All of us who have loved ones in the military. Some of my uncles were military men. My younger brother is about to join. And American citizens, what do we always say about our soldiers? Keep them safe, deploy them only when necessary, and when no longer necessary, bring them home. President Trump has done that better than anyone before him in the past 30 years at least, maybe longer. The Democrats in 2016 tried to paint him as an unstable warmonger, yet in truth, he has a significant disliking of war and applied military force in swift, calculated attacks that send a clear message of how powerful America is. And so it is in other nations' interest to not screw with America. Iran learned this lesson just last week. And rivals such as China, Russia, and North Korea have now likely gotten the message too. We will strike back if pushed into doing so, and it will devastate the country that does. After a year of taking harassment and escalation of violence from Iran, well, the Iranian regime, really. Not the Iranian people who were not happy with the regime. President Trump said in one swift stroke that ended the already too long life of Iran's head terrorist, "This ends now." It's actually similar in some ways to what Rudy Giuliani did for New York City in 1994. My dad, who would often drive into and out of New York City for his work, he was a physics professor for many years. He then later went into expert witnessing. I think in the early 90s he was working at Bell Labs. Or had he already transitioned to... I don't think he had his professorship yet. But anyway, it would often be driving into and from New York City. We lived in New Jersey back at this time. No, we moved from New Jersey to Ohio in 1993. So this was a little bit after, but still driving into New York. And it would sometimes bring me along. I would have been very small at this time. My dad has told me that going into New York was a grind through the garbage of the city, pretty much in more ways than one. Before Rudy Giuliani became the mayor, in the 80s and early 90s, there were these bums who would gather on the roads and bridges going to and from New York. And when the traffic was stalled, as it often is going into big cities, they would come and spit on the windows on people's cars, then proceed to wipe them down, then bang on the doors and windows of the passengers and demand payment for supposedly cleaning their windows, when in fact they had basically just assaulted and sullied them themselves. And if you refused to pay, then they would escalate the violence. The city did nothing about this until Rudy was elected to mayor and said, "This ends today." He put police at all the entrances and exits to the city and gave them the authority to arrest anyone doing this to the people driving in and out. And that solved the problem in a matter of days. Suddenly, more people started coming back to New York City, and the businesses and living conditions started to vastly improve. Now, I was too young at this time to remember this firsthand. I would have been not much more than a toddler back then. But my dad remembers it well. Rudy Giuliani may not be a very good lawyer, especially for Donald Trump, whose big mouth often doesn't help his case, and is not very good at choosing presidential lawyers. He must have been somewhat better at choosing business lawyers because he held up his businesses for quite a long time. But Giuliani was the best mayor that New York City ever had, and is remembered as such to this day. It shows that tough and decisive action does in fact work to deter assault and violence, and that is exactly what Trump has also learned during his time as president. Barack Obama, who was hailed by the media as this great civil rights activist, where he actually made things a lot worse than they were before, completely devastated America's foreign policy. He never learned to play his role as president better. And this somewhat comes out of that it was never his intention to learn to be, and somewhat comes out of he was never challenged, which means that never questioning, never challenging him was a huge detriment actually to his presidency. He destroyed the country of Libya without congressional approval of war. He, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden commanded the overthrow and murder of Gaddafi, who was, okay, not the nicest ruler in the world, but at least kept the country stable. Libya is now a hellhole, where human slavery has returned, and economic refugees, who are different from war refugees, are now pouring into Europe, have been for half a decade or more at this time, and in droves are destabilizing the European people. Obama created a godless clusterfuck of a mess of the world, and he never learned from it, never cared to learn from it. He just called everyone who opposed or questioned him as racist, an accusation that the mainstream media all over the world have been only too happy to parrot. President Trump is trying to clean up Obama's mess, a mess that Hillary Clinton, had she gotten elected, would have exacerbated by 1,000-fold, which is why in 2016 she needed to go down in a humiliating defeat. And come this new American election in 2020, we need to deal the Democrats another humiliating defeat. President Trump has only gotten better at his job. Before, he was largely appeased and doing nothing when Iran would attack ships in the Straits of Hormuz, when he would shoot down an American drone, when Iran would strike down an American drone, when they would spread terrorism all over the Middle East. President Trump held off doing anything until the Iranian militia, by the way, planned by Qasem Soleimani. Qasem Soleimani was directly responsible, masterminded the deaths of hundreds of Americans, hundreds more of his own people, by the way. Eventually, you gotta do something. Eventually, you have to put your foot down. Now Trump has done that. In the last months of 2019 and first weeks of 2020, he has taken out two of the world's most evil terrorists, Baghdadi and Soleimani, and has restored America's economy to better than it's been in decades. Well, that was actually a project over the so far 3 years of his presidency. All the while putting up with all of the hatred, slander, and impeachment attempts that have zero foundation to stand on. We need President Trump for the next 4 years. This is Kestrel. I will talk to you again soon.